well-known monographs are Marx After Sraffa, The Value Controversy, Fundamental Issues in Trade Theory, Trade Amongst Growing Economies, Wrestling with Time, Questions for Kalekians, From Exploitation to Altruism. His public work has a worldwide recognition. More than 1,000 citations have been given to his research work. We are very happy and honored to have him here today with us for the opening session of the conference. His presentation today challenges the foundations of consumer theory in microeconomics, and the title of Professor Stillman's presentation is The Consumer Economic Theory, an Individual or a Household. So I would like to invite Professor Stillman to the floor. Thank you very much.
First, my thanks to the Bahçeşehir Üniversitesi for inviting us to this marvelous city of Istanbul, which I'm visiting for the first time. Just wonderful. I hope you all have a chance to see quite a lot of it. As Professor Sunis has kindly said, the title of my paper is The Consumer in Economic Theory, an Individual or a Household. I begin with a quotation from the famous economist Ronald Coase, 1937. Economic theory has suffered in the past from a failure to state clearly its assumptions. Economists, in building up a theory, have often omitted to examine the foundations on which it was erected. This examination is, however, essential, not only to prevent the misunderstanding and needless controversy which arise from a lack of knowledge of the assumptions on which a theory is based, but also because of the extreme importance for economics of good judgment in choosing between rival sets of assumptions. The end of the quotation. This quotation, in which Coase insists on the need to examine the foundations of economic theory, comes, as you will probably recognize, from his famous paper on the theory of the firm, the nature of the firm. But his observations apply with equal force to the other leg of economic theory, the theory of consumption. As Mascolay, Winston and Green put it in their excellent 1995 text, there are two sets of agents in the economy, individual consumers and firms. And in their view, indeed, the most fundamental decision unit of microeconomic theory is the consumer. It would then follow that there ought to be a sharp conceptual clarity about the foundations of consumer theory, in line with Coase's advice. Unfortunately, the relevant literature in consumer theory is far from exhibiting an agreed and clear starting point. As was noted by Vickrey in his 1964 book Microstatics, the acting units in this world of exchange and consumption are variously termed consumers, individuals, households, or economic men. Now, even if we leave aside the term economic man, because it's very confusing and has all sorts of historical associations which we don't wish to take up, even if we restrict ourselves to consumers, individuals and households, we are still left with an ambiguity at the very foundation of consumer theory. Is the consuming agent to be understood as a single individual or as a household. Obviously, they're not the same thing. And according to Combes, we should be very clear in our foundational assumptions. In the first part of this lecture, we show by example just how far writers on consumption theory are from using clear, agreed and consistent foundational assumptions. Later in the lecture, I indicate very briefly that the classical liberal approach to economics also faces certain foundational issues concerning the individual, the household, the children, the family, and so on. Later in the lecture, I shall consider both which starting point ought to be adopted in consumer theory and some of the implications for both standard explanatory and welfare micro of making that correct choice. So the first section, substantial section then, gives a number of examples from well-known papers and books about how economists introduce the consumer. I begin with Slutsky's famous paper of 1915, because it is the formal modern theory of consumer behaviour I wish to focus on. It is not necessary here to attend to the very important technical aspects of Slutsky's essay. What we must note is that Slutsky refers throughout the paper either to the individual or, a little less often, to the subject. Nevertheless, in section 6, headed Variations of the Individual's Demand as a Function of Income, he suddenly writes, for example, suppose that a poor family, in consequence of a slight increase of income, consumes more meat. The behaviour of a family is here presented as an example of an individual's behaviour. So what does he mean by individual, the consumer, the subject? It's unclear. He has made it unclear what he means. While Slutsky's usual terminology points clearly and consistently to the consumer as an individual, a subject, and that is true in Italian as well as in English, he sets a bad example of playing fast and loose with the meaning of the consumer. And unfortunately, we are going to see that his bad example has been followed by other writers. A major role in introducing the work of Slutsky, at least to the English-speaking world, was of course played by Allen and Hicks. 4 years after their famous joint Economica paper of 1934, Allen himself devoted many pages of his mathematical analysis for economists to the theory of the consumer. Throughout these pages, he writes almost consistently of the consumer, the individual, and individual consumer, his preferences, his tastes, his income, etc. And yet, when Allen first introduces the theory of consumer behaviour, he refers to the choice of an individual consumer, for example, a family. Now again, we're not sure what he means. Nowhere in the subsequent pages is there any hint that the individual might mean the family. It's just the one reference at the beginning. Nor is there any discussion of how the marginal rate of time preference for an individual, or more generally the marginal rate of substitution, how such things are to be understood if the individual is really a family. What does it mean to talk about the rate of time preference for a group of individuals? It's not obvious. Allen, as you would expect, because he was a quite mathematical author, is very careful with respect to technicalities. For example, it devotes quite a long space to the integrability problem, which is notorious in consumer theory. But although he worries about technical questions, he's offhand about the foundational issue of the very nature of the consuming agent. In Value and Capital, Hicks is more consistent. He refers always to a single consumer or an individual. Quite consistently with this, he points out that preferences can cover the purchase and sale of goods not to satisfy one's individual wants, but in order to satisfy the wants of other people or what one supposes those wants to be. Hicks does not expand on this remark, but clearly it could cover the case of an individual who acts as the head of the household and makes selling and purchasing decisions on behalf of all members of the household. Let us turn to Samuelson's equally famous Foundations of Economic Analysis. It was 1947, but it was written before that. It got held up because of the war. Chapter 5 and the final section of Chapter 6 deal with the theory of consumption in its purely explanatory aspects. Samuelson here refers to the individual, or less often the consumer, to he, to his. And there is no suggestion that these words are to be taken other than literally. In Chapter 8, however, on welfare economics, matters become less straightforward. While discussing the social welfare function, Samuelson makes this remark: certain of the variables can be thought of as referring to a particular individual or family. In particular, the indifference levels. They might refer to an individual or a family. He then proceeds to consider the assumption that individuals' preferences are to count